Alright. Revenge will be mine at the World Championship this year. We are only a few weeks away now from the 2024 World Championship, where my team, Team 7, with Raymond Dye and Ryan Yu, will compete for the chance of becoming the Master Duel World Champions. After losing in the finals last year, we are more determined than ever to claim the title of World Champion. And last year, a 3v3 event was not what people expected. This year, again, 3v3 environment with a different rule set than what you'd expect from a normal Yu-Gi-Oh tournament, and different than any other Master Duel competition, whether it be Challenger Cups, Duelist Cups, or any other non-Konami hosted events. So today we're going to break down the rules and tournament structure of the 2024 Master Duel World Championships that was just announced in the Master Duel client, as well as some of the potential strategies and things to look out for, as myself and some of the other best teams from across the world will be competing in Seattle only a few weeks away. Before I get into the rules breakdown, if you have any input on any strategies you might think could be interesting for the World Championship, then let me know down below. If you disagree with any of my opinions, or if you think there's a point that I missed that has more relevancy than maybe I gave it credit for. And I think it opens up several different avenues that are otherwise unexplored in the Yu-Gi-Oh space. But with that said, let's get actually into it. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel WCS 2024 Finals will be a series of battles between a team of 3. There will be 12 teams fighting for the title of champion. The winning team from last year, not us, as well as 3 teams that earned their place to the Duelist Cup, one of which will be us. Ryan Yu qualified with the win from the December Duelist Cup. We also won in March. He's just crazy. 6 duels through regional qualifiers and 2 through season points. Included in these 12 teams are some real powerhouses, like last year's winning team, Joshua Smith's team. A fantastic player, of course, and not just in Master Duel. They've proven that in TCG several times. We've also got Master Duel powerhouses, like from Japan, Tasaku, who consistently is one of the top-ranking players in the Duelist Cup system and qualified for the World Championship last year as well. Interestingly, many of the teams that qualified last year for the World Championship have requalified this year, even though last year's was only 8 teams. All 4 team captains from the top 4 of last year's Master Duel World Championships have requalified. Obviously, the first place Worlds team under Joshua Schmidt, second place team is my team, and then the Brazilian team with Rafael Reich and Yugioh, and the Japanese team, I'm not sure exactly who it is, but I do know it is led by Tasaku once more. And I think it's really cool that the same players are requalifying, showing level of consistency, as well as skill expression involved with the format that Master Duel promotes. Something where in the TCG doesn't really happen. I think it's super cool, and typically a good sign of skill, even if the Duelist Cup format may seem toxic from afar. And yes, it has problems, but we've addressed this kind of conversation another time in this channel. You want to go listen to my thoughts on that, then this video is where you should do that. But either way, press forward onto the World Championship itself. The first stage of the tournament is going to be a round robin, where teams are split into 2 groups. Last year, there were only 4 teams per group. Now there's going to be 6, and then you'll play each team once. So each team will play 5 different opponents. Now, during each of those rounds where you're playing an opponent team, each player plays against each opponent. So you'll do best of 1 duels, where player A plays player A, B plays B, and C plays C. And then you rotate afterwards so that eventually, if I'm player C, for example, I'll play against A, B, and C throughout that round. Meaning, against Josh's team, I'd play Emery, Quantel, and Josh all within the round. The structure supports a best of 5. The winner of that round is decided by whoever reaches 5 game wins through the team first. This is all the same from last year, and like a normal 3v3, we can communicate with our teammates. When one of us finishes first, we can talk to each other, or even if we have any advice. This can also matter for some callouts, where you can say your opponent is on X deck, X staples, and you'll see why that may matter in a bit. Konami's also announced that decks must follow the Forbidden Limited list effective August 10th, as well as only using cards available on that date. That's important because if there's another ban list or a new set coming into effect before the World Championship, then they will not be in effect for Worlds, so we can practice now with the card pool, as well as we can give opinions for the cards right now without having to worry about anything being outdated. It'd be kind of lame if they release more cards or whatever before the World Championship, because it almost feels like we'd be having a fake format. However, Worlds is always like that for some reason, and I think that's kind of not good, but yeah, that's something that Yu-Gi-Oh! Likes to do. And then we get to the interesting part in where there becomes real decision-making in the construction of your deck lineup. Each player can use up to 2 decks, and can choose which the 2 decks to use for each duel. This is not Last Hero Standing or Conquest like in Hearthstone. You can play the same deck every single game. You're not obligated to win with both decks like you are in Conquest, and you're not trying to eliminate all of your opponent's decks like you would with Last Hero Standing. There's really no reason to have 2 decks in theory unless you have something you actually want to switch up against. Like if you expect a bad matchup, or if you find something that can prey on an easy matchup. Even more interestingly, the ban list and card pool is restricted across the entire team's 6 decks. That means 3 in 1 deck means 0 in the rest, or 1 in 3 decks each means that 3 decks have 0 and those other 3 decks only have 1 copy. However, 3 cards can be designated as shared cards. These will ignore that limitation. What that means is with 3 maxis, those 3 maxis can be spread between 6 decks. So if we decide to share maxi, which I expect literally every team to do, then we can each use 3 maxis and bypass the restriction. But however, with only 3 cards being able to be shared, it pretty much guarantees we can't play the same deck across multiple different decks. So this is where it gets interesting. How are we supposed to approach deck building in here? Now, with the shared card philosophy, you could decide to share some engine pieces. For example, the Sinful Spoil engine is one that's interesting because most of the times you may only play 1 original Sinful Spoil or 1 Poplar, depending on the deck. So theoretically, you could say to share your Diabell Star. Then 3 decks could potentially play the 1 Poplar and 1 original, as well as 3 Diabell Star. You could then also share Bonfire and add these 7 limited Bonfires to each of those 3 decks, really giving you 3 fire decks. That obviously means giving up the shared cards for staples, however, which can also be important. For example, if you choose to share Diabell Star and Bonfire for the sake of playing multiple fire decks, say I want to play Race and Fire King, well then what do you do against Maxi? Because you may be able to share Maxi still as your 3rd shared card. But now, when you're playing a deck and your opponent Maxis you, only 3 Ash Blossoms total will be in all your decks. Same with 1 Crossout and 2 Call by the Graves, leaving you mostly defenseless to what's otherwise the best card in the game. These are going to be some of the decisions that the teams are going to be making as they build their decks and their lineup. And if you decide that you'd rather share staples, you'd rather share Ash Blossom, Call by the Grave, or even other staples that are good like Impermanence, Nibiru, Gamma, Talents, Droplet, then any of those shared cards that would also go alongside Maxi or whatever would mean that's engine you can't be sharing. So this means that there is a good chance that several fire decks won't be in one lineup, only really one can exist. Now you could find concessions. For example, Rescue Ace did get 2nd place at a YCS in the TCG before the Sinful Spoil cards. That version of the deck is very much still playable, and Princess is still legal, so it would be the version of Rescue Ace that exists in the TCG, but still with some buffs. You could always also decide to hedge your bets, and even though you don't want to share 3 witches, you could decide that each deck may deserve the originals, because those you don't really have to spare, and then you could play 1 or 2 copies of witch in each deck. You could also decide that original is now more valuable, and you could play 2 witches and 1 original in one deck, and then 2 originals and 1 witch in another deck, finding a sort of halfway point between playability with fire decks. Of course, you'll then still come into the same issue when it comes to sharing cards like Poplar, as well as Bonfire, Snake Eyes Ash, and all that sort. Now, I haven't mentioned extra deck cards yet, and those also fit very interestingly into this equation. Because let's think about it here. Now, normally we don't think of extra deck cards as being the mandatory staples, but in reality, there are staple extra deck cards. One that comes to mind the most, SP Little Knight. So this card's at 3, and decks don't need 3 of these. They only really need 1, barring maybe exceptions like Rescue Ace kinda wants 2 of them. But if I have 6 decks total, unless I share that SP Little Knight, only 3 decks can get SP for 1 each. So we will have to decide 3 decks then that don't have SP Little Knight, or I decide that the staple I want to share is then SP. Now, that seemingly is lower value because I'm only sharing a 1 of between decks instead of a 3 of. That is another argument for Callby not being as good to share, because you're not sharing as many valuable cards. However, at least with extra deck cards, you are able to access it every game, so even though SP is a 1 of, it is a card that will always have an impact on the game state. And this doesn't just apply to SP, there's other staples as well, like Typhon or Raging Phoenix. Raging Phoenix is a cool example because fire decks will want to use Raging Phoenix with Zelantis as a way to combo. But what if you wanted to play Salamangreat on your team? And some of these decks have boss monsters that also work in other decks, and then they're forced to share them and weaken their own power level or just become unusable in general. This happened last year with Sprite, where Sprite did have to give up some of its Sprite Elves or Gigantics in order for the tier player to be able to play. And thankfully, no other deck really needed Elf or Gigantic, but it did make somewhat of a difference. It meant that they had to share, and if several decks start needing the Raging Phoenix Zelantis package, then maybe you can't approach Salamangreat as a playable deck, for example, in Master Duel, which, I mean, even though the deck isn't brilliant, is still playable. The shared card problem with the extra deck can also be exacerbated when a card is a 1 for seemingly no reason. Predaplant, Anaconda, and Curious. Only 1 deck can play them, and sharing those would seem very shit if several decks wanted to play them, albeit being an option. Last year, the problem was Divine Arsenal AA Zeus. We decided it wasn't worth sharing Zeus between decks but that pretty much meant that all the 6 decks have to decide which deserve Zeus. And even though Zeus is better in some decks than other, most decks will use Zeus if they can. And last year, Tier and Sprite, our main decks, both kind of decided that they want it. And as the Tier player, I had to say, fine, it's more important than Sprite, and I have to give it up. Another concession that comes up in this form of deck building. I believe last year, every single team ended up sharing Maxi and Ash Blossom, and it's really a statement to how powerful Maxi is and how much it warps the format. Now, the third card wasn't set. Call By is for sure a step down in terms of card quality than Ash Blossom, but if you really want to stop Maxi, then Call By is your best bet. For several other cards received consideration. Triple Tactics Talent and Cypher Gamma were both ones that were picked by other teams at the World Championship last year. This year, it'll be interesting to see if there are other ideas, specifically with how powerful fire decks are. There's a way for people to share the fire cards in a way that still makes them playable, or if any other staples will see more importance than Ash Blossom or Call by the Grave, or if Call by the Grave is even worth sharing at all compared to the other threats in the format. Now, while I don't want to divulge my own thoughts too much because I'm competing and I have to keep some secrets, I'm curious to see what you guys think in terms of this. How would you share your cards in a way that is effective for all your decks? Would you focus on staples, or do you try and be neat and cheeky and find a way to make several of fire decks viable, or maybe even several of other decks that you feel are worth playing? Now, the next layer to this deck building is the 6-deck equation. With 2 decks each, you could decide to never use your second deck, and that's kind of what I did last year. I felt like Tier was the best deck possible, and I played Tier, and then my secondary deck is Marincess. But the thing is, I never used the Marincess deck a single time. I may as well have only brought 1 deck. It was just Tier Element, which begs the question, why even have a second deck? And that's something that is important to discuss. Well, there's a few reasons. If you're not switching up which deck you play, then it may become easy for your opponent to predict what you're going to play and then play a specifically good matchup against you. If you're doing that, you want to pick a deck that is different enough from the other deck you're playing. That way, if your opponent brings in a supposed good matchup for one deck, the other deck is not going to still be a bad matchup. It'll be kind of role reversal. It'll be almost punished for your opponent making that decision. This type of deck building can be taken to certain extremes. For example, you could build just 2 strong decks with different ways of playing that it's hard to predict, or you could build 1 deck as a main deck and then a secondary deck that is built to cover your bases. You could also be building your deck in a way that it tries to prey on your opponent's choices. For example, we just said our opponent could pick a deck that had a good matchup against us. We could say, okay, if I want a bestial heavy deck to beat graveyard decks like Tier or Branded, then we could have a bestial deck specifically to bring in against those matchups. Something that would give us favorable matchups where otherwise we'd be playing almost 50-50s. What's important to remember across all of this, however, is that our cards will still be shared with every other player and every deck. This means that we can't just build like 6 hand trap decks, because how the hell do you share 3 Imperm, 3 Veiler, 3 Ash, 3 Maxi, 3 Nibiru, 3 Mourner across 6 different decks? Even if we share 3 hand traps, say Ash, Imperm, and Maxi, splitting up Veilers, Nibiru, Gamma, Mourner type cards can still be a bit of a problem. And the reverse goes for back removal or board breakers too. Say you want stuff to cover back row matchups, like if you're scared of a stun deck. There's a limited number of Lightning Storms you can fit between your decks without sharing the card. And Lightning Storm, typically a bad card in every other matchup, is not a card I can really see myself sharing. So all of it kind of plays together to create a unique ecosystem where you have to be steps ahead of your opponent, both in planning and during the actual matches. It's the extra levels of mind games and complexity that really draw me towards this unique format of dueling. And in a few weeks' time, I'm excited to be put to the test against all the other best duelists in the world to see if my team was able to formulate a better winning strategy as well as play better on that weekend to come out on top. Let me know what you guys think as far as all the World Championship rules go. Master Duel is still a young game, and the rules at Worlds are changing each year ever so slightly. I am very happy with the system Konami has produced here, and I am excited to be taking a part in Worlds once more. Hopefully we'll be able to win this year and thusly qualify for next year to keep competing if they change the rules once more. And now that we know the World Championship's full card pool and rule set, I'm curious to see what you guys expect to be played in the winning lineup at the World Championship. If you had to build a winning team of 6 decks, what shade cards would you use and what deck lineup would you maybe incorporate? I'm curious if you guys can predict what'll do the best, what my team or other teams will play, or if you have any interesting ideas of your own. But with that, I'll see you guys all then, and peace.